A black American veteran is humiliated and kicked out by a cafe owner, unaware that a white American soldier is watching the entire incident unfold. This tense moment sparks a story of justice, reconciliation, and change. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. If you like this story, please subscribe, like and share. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the little bell over the door of Haven Café jingled as Elijah, a 70-year-old black veteran, stepped inside. Dressed in a simple jacket and worn boots, his gait carried the weight of years spent serving his country. Elijah had returned from deployment overseas just 6 months earlier and was trying to find his footing in a world that seemed vastly different from the one he had left. The café, located in a small southern town, was modest but charming, with wooden tables, hand-drawn chalkboard menus, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Elijah chose a corner seat near the window, hoping for a moment of solitude to sip a cup of coffee and sort through the chaos in his mind. He glanced around and noticed the room was buzzing with life. A couple laughed over pastries, a group of college students worked on laptops, and a mother soothed her crying baby. Elijah felt a pang of envy. He had seen so much destruction and loss during his service that this ordinary scene felt almost otherworldly. As he approached the counter, the cafe owner, Mark Hastings, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, looked up. Mark's expression hardened the moment he saw Elijah. The warm, friendly demeanor he had offered other customers moments earlier evaporated, replaced with an air of suspicion. "What can I get you?" Mark asked curtly, his tone devoid of the usual cheer he offered patrons. Elijah, accustomed to such encounters, forced a polite smile. "Just a medium black coffee, please." Mark didn't reply. Instead, he eyed Elijah up and down as if deciding whether to serve him at all. The room seemed to grow quieter, and Elijah could feel the weight of other customers' eyes on him. When Mark finally handed him the coffee, he didn't bother with the usual pleasantries. Elijah thanked him quietly and returned to his seat. He sipped his coffee, trying to ignore the icy reception. But just as he began to settle into his thoughts, Mark approached his table. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Elijah froze. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," Mark replied, crossing his arms. "I don't want any trouble here, and I don't think you belong." The cafe went silent. Elijah felt his chest tighten as shame and anger battled within him. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said calmly. "I'm just sitting here, drinking coffee." Mark sneered. "This is my cafe, and I have the right to refuse service. Now, get out." Elijah stood, his hands trembling with restrained anger. He didn't want to make a scene, but the humiliation was almost unbearable. As he reached for his jacket, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to a woman seated at a nearby table. She had been quietly observing the exchange, her piercing blue eyes now fixed on Mark. Her tone was calm but carried an authority that made Mark hesitate. The cafe collectively held its breath as this unexpected intervention unfolded. The room was deathly quiet as all eyes shifted toward the woman who had spoken. She was in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. There was a quiet confidence about her, the kind that demanded attention without effort. "I asked," she repeated, her voice steady but firm, "is there a problem here?" Mark, clearly caught off guard, turned toward her with an awkward smile that barely masked his irritation. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern," he said, his tone condescending. "I'm just asking him to leave." "And why is that?" she pressed, her gaze unwavering. Mark faltered. "Because, well, it's my cafe. I can ask anyone to leave if I want." The woman's expression didn't change. "I didn't ask if you could. I asked why you're asking him to leave. What has he done?" Elijah stood frozen, torn between humiliation and gratitude for the stranger's intervention. He didn't want a confrontation to escalate on his account, but her determination to stand up for him was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't have to explain myself to you. I just don't want trouble in my establishment." The woman let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Trouble? He's sitting quietly, drinking coffee. The only trouble I see here is your behavior." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe. Several patrons were now watching intently, some with clear disapproval directed at Mark. Others appeared hesitant, unsure whether to involve themselves. Mark's face reddened. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "I'll tell you who I am," she interrupted, pulling a business card from her bag and placing it on the table in front of Mark. "I'm Major Rebecca Carter, United States Army. And I don't take kindly to seeing a fellow veteran treated like this." Elijah's head snapped up at her words, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected this stranger to be a veteran, let alone someone willing to step into such a situation on his behalf. Mark picked up the card and glanced at it, his expression shifting from anger to discomfort. I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't know what?" Rebecca asked, leaning in. "That he served this country just like I did? That he fought for your right to run this cafe? Or are you saying you wouldn't have treated him this way if you had known? Because either way, it's unacceptable." The room felt like it was holding its collective breath. Elijah could feel the weight of everyone's stares, but for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone under their scrutiny. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Rebecca didn't give him the chance. "You owe this man an apology," she said firmly. Mark hesitated, his pride clearly battling with the growing disapproval in the room. Finally, he muttered, "I'm sorry." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "I don't think he heard you." Mark cleared his throat and turned to Elijah. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time. Elijah looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly, though his voice carried an edge of weariness. Rebecca gestured to the seat Elijah had been occupying. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to buy this man a cup of coffee and hear his story. Unless, of course, you have a problem with me staying here too." Mark shook his head quickly. "No, no problem," he said, retreating to the counter. Rebecca turned to Elijah, her stern expression softening. "Do you mind if I join you?" Elijah nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. "Please," he said. As they sat down, the cafe began to return to its normal rhythm, though the tension lingered in the air. Rebecca ordered 2 coffees and settled into the chair across from Elijah, studying him with a keen, empathetic gaze. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "Unfortunately, it's something I've seen too often. Some people forget what respect looks like." Elijah shook his head. "You didn't have to step in like that. But, thank you. It means a lot." Rebecca smiled gently. "We look out for each other. That's what we do." For the first time since he had walked into the cafe, Elijah felt a sense of relief, as if the burden of isolation he'd been carrying had lifted, even if just a little. Their conversation was only beginning, but both sensed that this chance encounter was about to change more than just their afternoon. Rebecca leaned forward, her gaze steady but inviting. "Tell me about yourself," she said, her tone warm yet commanding enough to let Elijah know she was genuinely interested. Elijah hesitated, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. Sharing his story wasn't something he did easily. But something about Rebecca's presence, calm yet resolute, felt safe, like the camaraderie he had once known among his unit. "There's not much to tell," he said after a pause. "I served in the army for 8 years. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Got out 6 months ago and came back to, well, this." He gestured vaguely around the cafe, not just referring to the confrontation but to the invisible walls he encountered daily since his return. Rebecca nodded knowingly. "Re-entry can be rough. People don't realize how much changes, not just overseas, but here too. It can feel like you're a stranger in your own country. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, something like that. You give everything, and when you come back, he trailed off, his voice thick with unspoken pain. It's like none of it mattered. Rebecca didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let him gather his thoughts, her expression patient and understanding. I grew up in a small town not far from here, Elijah continued, his voice quieter now. Joined the army because I wanted to make a difference. Thought it'd be my way out, you know. And it was, for a while. I was good at it. Felt like I was part of something bigger. He paused, his eyes distant as if he were staring through the walls of the cafe and into the past. But now, I don't know. I came back, and the town I grew up in doesn't feel like home anymore. People look at me like I don't belong. And after today, he shook his head, his voice breaking. It's just one more reminder that maybe I don't. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. I get it, she said after a moment. You come back, and the world's moved on. People have no idea what you've seen, what you've sacrificed. And the worst part? They don't even ask. Elijah's eyes met hers, his guarded expression softening slightly. Yeah, he said. Exactly. Rebecca smiled faintly. You know, when I first got back from my last deployment, I had a hard time adjusting too. I kept thinking, I survived all that, and for what? To come back and feel invisible? Elijah nodded, his shoulders relaxing as her words resonated. But then, Rebecca continued, I realized something. The world we come back to might not always welcome us with open arms, but that doesn't mean what we did doesn't matter. And it doesn't mean we're alone. Elijah frowned, skepticism flickering in his eyes. Feels pretty lonely sometimes. Rebecca leaned forward again, her expression intense but kind. You're not as alone as you think, she said firmly. Look around. This place. That man. She gestured toward Mark, who was busy behind the counter, avoiding their eyes. They don't define you. What you did, who you are, that's what matters. And there are people who see it, who get it. You just have to find them. Elijah considered her words, a flicker of hope breaking through the heaviness in his chest. Maybe, he said quietly. Rebecca smiled, sensing she had reached him, even if just a little. How about this, she said. You and I, we stay in touch. I've got a network of vets I work with, men and women who've been where we've been. We get together, swap stories, support each other. It's not perfect, but it helps. Elijah hesitated, the vulnerability of opening up to strangers tugging at him. But the idea of finding others who understood what he was going through, who wouldn't judge or pity him, was tempting. All right, he said finally. I'll think about it. Rebecca grinned. That's all I ask. Their conversation continued, shifting between heavy memories and lighter moments as they shared pieces of their lives. For the first time in months, Elijah felt a connection, a reminder that he wasn't as isolated as he had believed. As they spoke, the cafe's energy seemed to shift. A few patrons who had overheard snippets of their conversation approached quietly, offering words of support and gratitude for their service. Even Mark, who had been avoiding them, seemed to soften, though he kept his distance. By the time Rebecca and Elijah finished their coffee, the atmosphere in the cafe had transformed. What had begun as an act of exclusion had turned into an unintentional lesson in compassion and community. Thank you, Elijah said as they stood to leave. For stepping in. For everything. Rebecca clasped his shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. Like I said, we look out for each other. You're not alone, Elijah. Don't forget that. As they walked out of the cafe together, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The autumn air outside the cafe was crisp and bracing, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Elijah and Rebecca stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the world go by. Though their conversation inside the cafe had ended, the weight of the experience lingered between them. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Rebecca asked, studying Elijah carefully. He nodded, though his hesitation was noticeable. "Yeah. I'm staying at a small place on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it works for now." Rebecca tilted her head, sensing there was more to his story but choosing not to press. "All right. But if you ever need anything, someone to talk to, a connection, even just a cup of coffee, you call me." She handed him another card, this one bearing her personal phone number. Elijah took it, his fingers brushing the edges thoughtfully. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice carrying a sincerity words couldn't fully capture. Rebecca nodded, offering a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Elijah. And remember, you don't have to fight these battles alone." As she walked away, Elijah stood there for a moment, watching her figure disappear into the crowd. He tucked the card into his pocket, the gesture feeling heavier than it should. Meanwhile, back inside the cafe, Mark Hastings was grappling with his own emotions. He had spent the better part of his life running this establishment, priding himself on being a respected figure in the community. But today, he had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about himself. Mark glanced at the table where Elijah and Rebecca had sat. The empty coffee cups were a reminder of his actions he wasn't proud of. As he wiped down the table, he couldn't shake Rebecca's words, "What he did, who he is, that's what matters." The other customers had returned to their conversations, but Mark couldn't ignore the glances some still threw his way. He felt their judgment, subtle though it was, and it gnawed at him. For the first time, he began to question the beliefs and assumptions that had driven his behavior. That evening, Mark sat alone in the quiet cafe after closing. He stared at the business card Rebecca had left behind, running his thumb over the embossed text. "What kind of person have I become?" he murmured to himself. He thought about Elijah, how the man had stood there, calm and composed, even in the face of blatant disrespect. Mark couldn't deny the courage that had taken, nor the grace Elijah had shown by accepting his apology. With a deep breath, Mark picked up his phone and dialed the number on Rebecca's card. The next day, Elijah was walking through the park when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he answered. "Hello." "Hi, Elijah. This is Mark Hastings, from the cafe." Elijah stiffened, his grip tightening on the phone. "What do you want?" I wanted to apologize again," Mark said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, and I realize I was wrong, more than wrong. I acted out of ignorance and prejudice, and there's no excuse for that." Elijah was silent, unsure how to respond. "I know I can't undo what I did," Mark continued. "But I want to make it right. If you'd be willing, I'd like to sit down with you. Hear your story. Understand what I didn't bother to understand before." Elijah hesitated. Part of him wanted to hang up, to tell Mark that his apology didn't erase the humiliation he had caused. But another part of him, the part that had fought for unity and understanding, knew this was an opportunity. "All right," Elijah said finally. "I'll come by the cafe tomorrow." When Elijah walked into the cafe the next day, it felt different. The usual buzz of chatter was quieter, and the regulars seemed to greet him with a newfound respect. Mark approached him cautiously, his demeanor far removed from the arrogance of the previous encounter. "Thank you for coming," Mark said, extending his hand. Elijah shook it, his grip firm but measured. "Let's talk." For the next hour, Elijah shared pieces of his life, his childhood in a small town, his decision to join the army, the struggles he faced during deployment, and the even harder challenges of coming home. Mark listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to guilt to determination. "I had no idea," Mark admitted when Elijah finished. I've spent so much time in my bubble, assuming things about people I know nothing about. That ends today." Mark's words carried a sincerity that surprised Elijah. "And how do you plan to change that?" Mark gestured around the cafe. "This place has always been about community. But I see now that I wasn't building a real one. I want to change that. Starting with you. Would you be willing to work with me? Help me create a space where everyone feels welcome." Elijah considered the offer. He could see the earnestness in Mark's eyes, the desire to make amends not just with him but with a community that had been marginalized for too long. "All right," Elijah said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Let's see what we can do." The following weeks marked the beginning of a transformation, both for the cafe and for the community it served. Mark Hastings, once a man content with his comfortable ignorance, threw himself into creating an inclusive space where everyone felt valued. True to his word, he sought Elijah's guidance every step of the way. Their first step was to host an open forum at the cafe, inviting veterans, community leaders, and patrons to share their stories. Rebecca, true to her promise, returned to help facilitate the event, bringing with her a few members of her veteran network. The evening of the forum, Haven Café was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation as people from all walks of life filled the space: farmers, teachers, college students, business owners, and even those who had never set foot in the cafe before. Elijah sat at the front of the room, nervous but determined. He had spent so long feeling like an outsider that the idea of addressing this crowd felt daunting. But as he scanned the room, he saw Rebecca's encouraging nod and Mark's hopeful gaze, and his resolve solidified. Mark opened the evening with a heartfelt apology, not just to Elijah but to the entire community. "I failed," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I failed to see the strength and humanity in someone who deserved my respect. I let my own biases blind me to the truth, that we are all part of the same community, and we all have something to learn from one another." He paused, scanning the room. This cafe was supposed to be a place of welcome. "I want to rebuild it into that. And tonight is the first step." The room erupted in applause, and Mark stepped aside to let others take the stage. One by one, people stood to share their experiences, of service, of hardship, of resilience. Elijah spoke next, his voice steady despite the tremor of nerves beneath it. He talked about the sacrifices he had made, the struggles he faced after returning home, and the pain of feeling invisible. But he also spoke of hope, how Rebecca's intervention reminded him that there were still people willing to stand up for what was right, and how Mark's willingness to learn gave him a reason to believe in change. "I don't want pity," Elijah concluded, his gaze sweeping the room. "What I want, what we all want, is respect. To be seen for who we are, not judged by the color of our skin, the uniform we wore, or the struggles we face." His words were met with a standing ovation, the sound reverberating through the cafe. Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat, but this time, it wasn't from shame or anger, it was from the overwhelming sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The forum was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Elijah worked together to make Haven Café a true hub for the community. They started hosting weekly events, veteran meetups, storytelling nights, and charity drives to support local causes. Mark also introduced a "Pay It Forward" board, where customers could prepay for meals or drinks for anyone in need. The board quickly filled with colorful notes, each one a testament to the kindness the community was capable of. Elijah became a regular fixture at the cafe, not as a customer but as a collaborator. He began mentoring younger veterans, helping them navigate the challenges of re-entry and find their place in civilian life. Rebecca continued to check in, her leadership and guidance proving invaluable. The cafe's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Word spread throughout the town, drawing more patrons and even local media attention. The story of Mark and Elijah, two men from vastly different backgrounds, brought together by conflict and united by a shared commitment to change, became a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Months later, Elijah stood behind the counter at Haven Café, helping Mark prepare for another busy day. The two had become unlikely friends, their bond forged through honesty, growth, and mutual respect. "You know," Mark said, pouring a fresh pot of coffee, "if you'd told me a year ago I'd be running a cafe with a black veteran I once kicked out, I'd have said you were crazy." Elijah chuckled, his deep laugh resonating through the room. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the worst moments." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm just glad I got the chance to make it right. Not everyone does." Elijah smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "And not everyone takes it. That's what matters." As the morning rush began, customers filled the cafe with laughter and conversation. Among them were faces both old and new, each one a testament to the power of community and the resilience of the human spirit. For Elijah, the cafe had become more than just a place to grab a cup of coffee. It was a symbol of second chances, of finding purpose, and of the simple truth that, no matter how broken the world might seem, change was always possible. And for Mark, it was a reminder that redemption wasn't just about saying the right words, it was about living them, day after day. Together, they proved that even the deepest divides could be bridged, with humility, courage, and a willingness to listen. The end. Please don't forget subscribe, like, shares, and comment.